Hello, my name is Patrick Usher, and in this video I will be telling you about some of my experiences at the POTS UK conference, which was in London last week, September the 8th, 2017. And it was a superbly organised conference. There were lots of talks, and it was a jam-packed day, and I learned a lot. And I also thought a lot of the research was very encouraging from the point of view of the ideas that I'm trying to put forward as well. And there'll be lots of videos, I would imagine, well at least 4 or 5 probably, that I'll be doing on the conference and over the next few weeks on my YouTube day. And however, in this talk, I wish to talk about one of the presentations in particular, which I felt really was very interesting from the point of view of the ideas I'm trying to put forward, and which I felt was kind of, for the most part, similar, and I wanted to talk about that one. Before I do, I want to just give the general caveat that, of course, I am offering my reflections secondhand on any of these talks. I know that all these talks are going to be up on the POTS UK website. They were filmed, so you'll be able to go and watch them, and I will point out, when they're up. I'm doing my best to convey what I saw and what I heard, but for my apologies for any errors. I am a second-hand source. Okay. So the talk I want to discuss first in this video was by Professor Markku Partinen, a Finnish professor, who was giving a talk entitled The Finnish Experience, Links Between POTS Dysautonomia, CFS-ME and Other Functional Disorders. Just before I go into what I thought were some of the most interesting aspects of what was a very interesting talk, just a little bit about Professor Partinen's background. He's a specialist in neurology and research director at the Helsinki Sleep Clinic. He is adjunct to the University of Helsinki in Finland and the University of Uppsala in Sweden. He has got his PhD from the University of Helsinki in 1982. He was a postdoc at Stanford, visiting professor at Bologna. He has been president of the World Association of Sleep Medicine and the Scandinavian Sleep Research Society. He is currently president of the Finnish Parkinson's Society. He's worked a lot on narcolepsy, and he's published more than 300 articles, and he is now working a lot on the autonomic nervous system, dysautonomia and POTS in particular. That is the background to Professor Partinen. Very distinguished, a lot of research, a lot of activity, and now turning his attention towards POTS. So let us consider some of the very interesting points that he made. So the first thing you see from this slide is he talked about the difference between the two different medical models, as it were. Between a kind of Western philosophical model, which has very much informed how we in the West think about medical matters, and also then a more sort of Eastern philosophical understanding of human existence, which he felt was much more pertinent to POTS. So Western philosophy, has, thanks to Descartes especially, that famous "I think, therefore I am" saying, has tended to operate on the idea of a mind-body dualism, separation of mind and body. The mind, in some sense, is operating on this ethereal realm, somehow apart from the functions of the body, and that's sort of Cartesian dualism, right? Now, those philosophical ideas have very much sort of been at the bedrock of the Western medical method, for better and for worse. It certainly has its plus sides. It basically tends to mean that Western medicine tends to hone in on specific parts of the body that are going wrong and see them as going wrong purely because of something that is aberrant at that particular site in the body. Whereas in a kind of more Eastern philosophical method, the mind and body are one, so what's happening, the whole is a very holistic view of the body, and mind as an overall psychophysical whole, as a kind of holistic entity, where what's happening in one part of the body will have an effect on another part of the body, and where the brain is also part of the picture, of what is affecting the body of the whole entity, the organism of the whole entity. Right? So Professor Partinen felt that the second view of the human organism is more accurate in general, and is certainly more accurate in relation to POTS. And in order to kind of set the scene for this, there's another very interesting slide here that you can see. He talked about how whatever emotions we have, these affect the entire autonomic nervous system in different ways. So, we can't regard when we're feeling happy or when we're feeling angry or when we're feeling fearful as being sort of, operating, as I said, on this ethereal realm of the mind, apart from our physical selves. As you can see from this slide, each emotion has a real effect on the whole autonomic nervous system. Look at, and of different intensities and different kinds. So look for example at happiness there. You really see that's affecting the whole body, or anger, there as well, and fear. These are all have deeply physiological aspects embedded in them. That there's this signal that comes down from the limbic system through the whole autonomic nervous system, and which really lights up and activates cells at all of these different levels. So this was kind of the point that he was, broadly speaking, trying to make, and I completely agree with. Now, how does this all relate to POTS? So this is interesting. Okay, so in the next slide, Professor Partinen introduced some very interesting ideas. Now, I'm just going to, before I get into them, I think that Professor Partinen here is along the right lines. However, he is using terminology from the 1930s. You can see that down at the bottom right there. He was drawing on someone called Lepage, who, if you look at the very bottom there, that article there, 1934. And Lepage had this idea of dividing people up into autophiliacs or normophiliacs. And this is sort of very 1930s-ish terminology, and I object to it for a few reasons which I'll talk about in a moment. But I do think that regardless of terminology, it may well be pointing to something important in relation to POTS, those who suffer with POTS. So in a nutshell, as far as I could best understand it, and I did talk to Professor Partinen afterwards as well, but I think Professor Partinen's ideas on this are as follows: that there are essentially two kinds of person. One of them is given an unfair hand in life, an unfair twist of fate, and the other isn't. Okay, and in the former category, we have people who have very sensitive brains. All right, they're more sensitive than most people. They are the highly sensitive person. Okay, and the reason they're highly sensitive is through no fault of their own, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I wouldn't. I'm a sensitive person. I wouldn't swap it for the world. But it's something that happens to them through traumas. Okay, and this isn't necessarily the case that. We're not just talking about childhood trauma, but we're talking about the fact that a parent, or even grandparent, or great-great-great-grandparent suffered traumas, okay, and those traumatic genes, the way of seeing the world in a response to trauma, get passed on generation to generation. And we know this to be the case. Studies have shown that a traumatized mother, actually, they give birth to a baby, and the baby automatically has a greater stress response and higher cortisol levels, that stress hormone, than someone who doesn't have a mother who was traumatized. So actually the genetics of trauma are passed on, right? So that's it's tough, right? It's tough. It certainly makes sense in my case more from my father, but anyway, it makes sense that I would have a more sort of sensitive view of the world, and genetically. But then it's not just genetically, also then as an infant, as a child growing up, autophiliacs, which is the term that Professor Partinen used to describe these people. I don't like the term because it literally means kind of loving yourself. I suppose it kind of, in a 1930s way, is implying neurosis. Professor Partinen kind of over concern with oneself. Professor Partinen was not using that at all. He did not say that. He was just mentioning the term as a helpful model for exploring these ideas. But I don't like the term myself. But anyway, yes, where was I? So there could be early childhood traumas. Again, there's nothing you can do about that as a child. You're stuck with it, so you're stuck with the circumstance. So maybe someone who's autophiliac, to use this term, a highly sensitive person, grows up in an abusive household. Maybe not both parents, but one of the parents might be abusive. So there's a kind of a traumatic environment. They grow up and it's chaotic. There's alcoholism, there's abuse, there's shouting, and all this kind of stuff. And so you grow up with a heightened flight or fight response, in your primitive brain, right? So one could have, it might not be the case that there's a kind of traumatic, abusive upbringing, but maybe the child, there's a terrible trauma that happens, to the child, or maybe one of their parents dies and they see them die, or something happens that is taking an already sensitive brain and making it more sensitive in early childhood. Okay, so there's this collection of people, a sizable amount of people who grow up with sensitive brains. That's the point that Professor Partinen is making. Now, however, that does not mean that these people are going to go on and get POTS, because you don't get POTS by having a sensitive brain in and of itself. But the point that Professor Partinen made is that basically, if you take a sensitive brain and you add later in life very much more severe traumas, whether a one-off or several over several years, or building slowly, acute, whatever it is, then you might get POTS. Okay, so if you take a sensitive brain and add another humdinger of a big trauma later, then that might be the kind of final straw, the perfect storm to tip the limbic system over into full crisis mode. Okay, or as Professor Partinen would put it, the autonomic nervous system. As you can see from this slide, and I just go back to that. So just to summarize, you see at the top there you have genetics, the microbiome, so you have a susceptibility. Sorry about that. Rewiring your brain does not cure you of the occasional stammer. So you have that word, genetically, you are susceptible, thank you Patrick, to trauma. So then that leads to what was called autophilia, this kind of high sensitivity, which in turn, if you add in these infections, or stress and other things, and he really talked about the possibility of severe traumas at this point. So you're thinking of viral illnesses, you're thinking of surgeries that go wrong, you're thinking of possibly also severe psychological trauma, but all of these things together which really tip you over. And then you get all of these sort of symptoms which he defined there: autopathia, allergies, asthma, spasmophilia, IBS, neuropathia, autonomic disturbances, chronic pain, psychopathia, anxiety, and so on. Now, I don't like any of these terms. Okay, because I think they are rather 1930s-ish. But I get where they're coming from. I get where they're coming from. And so yes, this is his key idea, basically, that there are these highly sensitive people. They're highly sensitive for no fault of their own. They are passed on genetically, genes of trauma, and they are then probably at a childhood level exposed to further trauma. So they grow up with these sensitive brains, and then something happens in later life. They have a humdinger of a viral illness. They're in a car accident, something. They have a surgery that goes wrong, and then bang, the sensitive brain tips over into complete crisis. It's never the person's fault, but there's a kind of susceptibility to this. Okay, and that's the point he's trying to make. Now, From my point of view, I don't know if this is true. There's been no studies into this question. I think it's something to study. I think why it is that people have not studied the brains of those with POTS, I do not know. They all know it's autonomic nervous system dysfunction. They all know that the ANS operates in the brain. Why no one studied it, I haven't got an iota. But, so one can't really comment on this fully. But I do think there's something to this. I don't think it's necessarily going to be true in every case. Okay. I don't think it's necessarily going to be true in every case. There may be cases of people who are not genetically or predisposed or from a childhood level predisposed to be very sensitive, who may end up with POTS. So I don't know if it works across the board, but I think it's an interesting idea for your consideration, and I do look forward to your thoughts on it. To continue on with the very interesting ideas that Professor Partinen was putting forward, he talked about a book called The Polyvagal Theory by Porges. You see that on the slide here. And this is interesting because he's talking about the role of the vagus nerve, which is very important in the sympathetic and parasympathetic response in the autonomic nervous system. And but basically what Professor Partinen was suggesting, and this is exactly in many ways in another language what I'm trying to put forward, is that in POTS there is no break on the sympathetic branch of the vagus nerve. It just remains stuck on. And that's exactly pretty much the same as what I've been trying to say, that the limbic system enters a chronic state of hardwired crisis. It's different language describing similar things. So the other point, in line with that, he's done these studies. You can see here on this slide, POTS decrease of parasympathetic tone. And this is rather complicated, but if you look at the lines on this chart of POTS patients that he was testing, this was interesting. So actually, you see the bottom line there, which goes down at a certain point and stays down. That's the parasympathetic response. So what Professor Partinen was showing here is that what he said was when that line went down, that is when people were tilted upright. The POTS patients were tilted upright. So when the POTS patient is tilted upright, according to Professor Partinen's research, their parasympathetic rest and digest response goes down. So there's a kind of added element there to the theories that I'm trying to put forward as well about decrease in parasympathetic tone in POTS patients. And similarly, he's also shown in sleep that there is a nocturnal dysfunction of the cardiac autonomic nervous system. This is in chronic fatigue syndrome, but they overlap with POTS, as a lower parasympathetic tone in deep sleep and higher sympathetic tone asleep. So even when asleep, those with limbic system dysfunction, unfortunately, for all concerned, have this chronic state of crisis ongoing. So a higher sympathetic tone is active and a lower parasympathetic one. And now to conclude Professor Partinen's discussion, a very interesting discussion. One thing, that was really interesting, by the way, that he mentioned from this last slide, is that the future international classifications of diseases, the ICD, POTS will be considered a neurological disorder. And so his question mark to the audience, as it were, and unfortunately there wasn't time for questions, but is POTS mainly a problem of parasympathetic vagal tone? So is it a problem of the lack of parasympathetic response following a traumatic event? Absolutely it is. And in short, that idea there you can see on his slide, the origins of POTS, genetic susceptibility plus a traumatic event disturbs the autonomic nervous system. The trauma may be a microbial attack, immunological attack, physical trauma, or mental trauma. Okay, and the function of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is disturbed, but without any structural damage. This is a very interesting point. So, so that's kind of hopeful point. Basically, it's a kind of the overall function goes haywire, but the autonomic nervous system itself is not being damaged. So from my point of view, once you rewire the ANS out of that dysfunction, then it will be functional again. So it's not like autonomic failure where actually the whole system just shuts down, right? And finally, is the last slide here. Professor Partinen's call for action. What I thought was really interesting here was the mention of the dynamic neural retraining system. Great, okay, so you see that there, treatment and rehabilitation, how to increase parasympathetic tone and decrease sympathetic tone, different forms of CBT and mental training, rewiring, dynamic neural retraining. There we are. That's what we need. And I didn't even know he'd heard of it. Anyway, so he's calling for studies on that. I obviously totally agree, and I think he's spot on with that. So, right. And also he wants epidemiological studies to find out what the prevalence of POTS is. That'd be great, because at the moment we're just kind of guessing, the different figures that come out, like 500,000 to 3 million in the United States alone. That's quite a variety of numbers there. We need to know what the actual prevalence of POTS is, so that we can start saying and lobbying and saying this is really important, that this gets greater recognition and is treated. So this was Professor Partinen's talk. I thought it was fascinating. I really think he is on to something. I wonder what your thoughts are. Again, as I say, I didn't like the terms autophilia or normophilia. It is from the 1934 paper. He was using that as a springboard for discussion. I don't think that's kind of a useful term. I think it's as I say, 1930s-ish. So I would prefer to use the term sensitive, highly sensitive, sensitive brain for genetic reasons or for early trauma reasons, but I certainly wouldn't use the word autophilia. But I wonder what your thoughts are on this basic idea and does it match with your experience? Do you feel, that you had kind of early childhood trauma or that you were born with a sensitive brain, and that this might then have meant that later in life, when you finally had that perfect storm of trauma, that it was a sensitive brain meeting the perfect storm of trauma? Or alternatively, is it your experience that you were born with a not particularly sensitive brain, but later in life there were many traumas that kind of reached you there, so you weren't susceptible to trauma, but there were enough traumas that kind of pushed you over the line into autonomic nervous system dysfunction? What is your experience with that? Now, regardless of all of that, whether one is susceptible to POTS or not, or whatever, you can rewire your brain. It doesn't matter. Okay, I want to make that point. From my point of view, you could be born with a very sensitive brain. Okay, and you could have a viral illness when you're 20 and you get tipped over into autonomic nervous system dysfunction. You can still rewire out of that. Now, you may still have a sensitive brain. Okay, I still have a sensitive brain. I'm very sensitive to life. Okay, I'm more emotional and other things than the norm, as it were. But I don't mind that as long as I don't have POTS. Okay, and actually, it's a strength. I'd much rather be sensitive than not. I'd much rather feel than not. So and all that kind of thing. So I just but I want to make that point that it doesn't. This is not a negative. Okay, it's not a negative if one has a higher sensitivity. From my view, it's a positive. The main thing is just to be sure that one doesn't tip over into POTS. But if one does, that one rewires back out of it. So I look forward to your thoughts on Professor Partinen's paper. I'll be publishing another video next week on the conference. I look forward to your thoughts.